Of all the podcasts on all the platforms, you have landed here at Pondercast. Welcome. Pondercast is an independent organism, which means any financial support we get comes from you, the one with the ears listening. You can support us with a small monthly donation at patreon.com/pondercast because supporting content that is meaningful to you just helps ensure Pondercast will be here when you want it. Big thanks to one of our earliest supporters, Mike Olney, and to our newest, Nadine James. Okay, let's do this. Let's Pondercast. I've known Chili Gonzales for a long time, long enough to see him through many phases of his career. I watched him evolve from being Jason Beck, a struggling indie rock musician living in Toronto, to being Chili Gonzales, living in Berlin, working with other artists on the edge like Peaches and Maki. He called himself the king of the Berlin underground. And then there were those collaborations with Leslie Feist. That kind of moved him more into the mainstream. And then, surprisingly, a record of solo piano playing came out. And who and what Chili Gonzales was all about, for me, got wider and I got more curious. Now he's started a music academy. He calls it the conservatory. He has always been a ferocious artist, pushing himself and the audience as a producer, writer, pianist, rapper, social commentator, professor, and self-described musical genius. So 3 solo piano albums later, I sit down with Chili to talk about this journey, about how he became himself. This is an unedited interview, minus one cough, because I wanted to give you the full Gonzo experience and have you feel the chill, by which I mean the passion, the drive, the willingness that he has as an artist to work beyond his comfort zone. If you are looking for a creative wake-up call, if you feel a yearning to stop comparing who you are and what you do to what other people or artists are doing, if it's time for you to become more like yourself, you are in the right place. Let's start with music. This is a piece from his solo piano album number 3. This is Pretenderness. Welcome to Pondercast. Gonzo? Should I call you Gonzo? What shall I call you?
I don't know. Most people call me Maestro these days.
Maestro! You're working up in the world. That's beautiful.
Gonzo is also fine. We've known each other for more than 2 decades, so I think maybe you can call me Gonzo.
Okay. Hi, Gonzo. Now tell me what you remember.
Well, your reputation preceded you because I grew up watching Much Music. As I tell people that basically, watching City TV and Much Music and all of this, the infancy of sort of pop culture as a Canadian growing up in the early 80s, you were an icon already. And this was sort of, I had a strict classical upbringing that was very quickly sort of opposed by what I saw on television. And my fantasies of becoming a pop star were clashing with what I loved about what my grandfather was showing me about classical music. He was my first teacher. And in a way, looking back and where I've ended up, I kind of managed to integrate those two sides of myself because I didn't want to have to choose. I felt like if I ignore what my grandfather was showing me, then I'm willfully turning my back on hundreds of years of musical research done by all the great composers. At the same time, to not have fun, to not give myself the chance to fantasize that I could dance on the ceiling like Lionel Richie would also be a sad life in music. So I tried to have it both ways, and maybe that's where I've ended up now.
That's so interesting because when I knew that I wanted to talk to you, I wanted to do an interview about becoming. And I remember a conversation with you when you were Jason Beck and we were standing outside of the Much Music studios right by the front door. And you were telling me that you were moving away, that you were leaving Canada and you were going to go to Europe. And I have never forgotten that conversation because you were so discouraged and you really felt like there was nothing for you here in Canada and you really needed to go. And your discouragement really affected me in that moment. I really felt that you were really struggling with what you were going to do and that you were on your way and you didn't know what was going to happen, but that you had to go. Do you remember those days?
I do remember acutely that discouragement you talk about, but I think I also have a gift for using my natural emotional state as an opportunity for self-storytelling, for self-mythologizing. And so I think when that discouragement happened, I decided to go all the way. That's the kind of person I am. You know the expression, drive into the skid? Mm-hmm. That's what I do. I do that on stage. If a show has antagonistic energy, I go with the antagonism. I've had concerts that turn really violently oppositional with the audience. Some shows are just full of pure angelic musical energy. Those are wonderful too. I try not to judge the emotional state of what's happening in a concert because every emotion is equal. I might have my preferences, but I have to use what's in the room. So when I felt that discouragement, rather than let it turn me bitter, I decided to make it part of my story. I decided to say, this is the origin story of the supervillain I'm going to become. This is the moment that lightning hits the laboratory. This is the moment where I, like Lex Luthor, decide that I will show them all. And that's the kind of person I am. So that discouragement that I expressed to you, which you felt having such a searing hot core of molten lava.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe another person would have just been discouraged and stayed. Maybe another person would have been discouraged and left, but not necessarily tried to feed on the energy of that discouragement. Mm-hmm. I have a song I do on stage that came out in 2009 called "The Grudge," and it's a song. It's a song with vocals. It's a kind of spoken word or a rap piece, you might say, about how sometimes you want to hold on to the energy of a grudge. There's a moment in the song where I say, The truth is I need you. If you ever said sorry, I would hate to believe you. So please don't. I need the discouragement sometimes so that I can feed on it because it will give me energy. I don't judge the emotional energy that leads me to be creative. It's not always positive. I don't appreciate artists who make it seem like it's always just positive inspiration. I know these artists, and I sometimes see the hypocrisy in what they present to the public as, I just do this because I love my audience. I find that hard to believe. A performer's relationship to their audience will always be fraught. I try not to paper over it. I try to include it as part of my persona, my creative process, and especially my demeanor and behavior on stage needs to be authentic and needs to be exaggerated, but the source of it has to be authentic for it to then become part of the show, just as that discouragement became part of my career story that I told myself. And at that time, I was coming off of a botched record deal with Warner Music Canada, and I felt a lot of resentment towards some of the people who had worked there, rightfully or wrongfully. I think with time, I understood that it couldn't be entirely placed on their shoulders, that it's a complicated process to be signed to a record company and who is responsible for something working or not. But at that time, I decided to feed on that resentment. And there's an album I did where I talk about a revenge fantasy on someone who works at Warner Music Canada, a probably very lovely human being in retrospect, who I essentially threw under the bus in order to feed on that and make it part of my story. That's, I think, what artists do, whether it's justified or not. You want to use what happens to you and make sense of it and feed on it for energy. To not do so feels like a missed opportunity. And if I had just taken that discouragement as a kind of, well, that's what happened, I guess I'll just stay in Canada and hope for something better. If I hadn't fed on it and used that energy to get my ass to Europe and reinvent myself, I would have seen that as a missed opportunity, and I didn't miss that opportunity. I did use it, and I don't feel that burning hot lava of resentment anymore deep in my gut because it's 25 years ago now or so. But boy, I'm glad I did it at a time, wow. And perhaps that led me to be able to get over it. But don't worry, there's been lots of other resentments since then. So, I still have a lot to feed on, a lot of grievances.
When you got over there and you were in the process of reinventing yourself, was it something from within or something that you saw outside in the world that told you you could be all the things that you needed and wanted to be?
It's leaving. It's going to a place where you don't have any bearings. It's getting away from what you know. It gets you out of the small-minded mentality of what is everyone else doing? What is everyone else thinking? I moved to Berlin, East Germany in 1998. It's not the Berlin of today. My first apartment had a coal heater and a hot water boiler for the shower that only gave you a few minutes of hot water at a time. There were no street lights on the street where I lived. It felt like I'd moved to a communist country. I couldn't understand what people were saying in the subway. It drives you into yourself in the best possible way. I believe that to be an artist, you need to get away from what other people are doing. The quest to be an artist is to become more yourself. And to go somewhere new really, really frees you up. And all of a sudden, I felt like I could do anything because I wouldn't be judged. I used to get obsessed with which journalist at Now magazine I thought snubbed me at the time. That's not the healthy kind of resentment to feed on. And by going to Berlin, it all was, in a way, abstracted for me. I didn't know.
It was all on you.
It was all on me. It made me much more curious about myself rather than what others were doing. And got me out of a kind of strategic thinking, how to outmaneuver the other musicians around me, or how to steal the best parts from what they're doing, or how to avoid their mistakes. It really keeps you in a very small mindset when you're constantly worried about what everyone around you is thinking. And to go to a foreign country, which linguistically and culturally was so different and so geographically far away, it was just very liberating. And it really let me become myself and reinvent what I'd been doing in a way that was much more proactive. I had some outdated beliefs when I was signed to Warner Music Canada. That was the time of indie rock. Remember that?
Yes.
There was an idea that you shouldn't be calculated. There was an idea you shouldn't be ambitious. There was an idea that you shouldn't be funny. There was an idea that you shouldn't be a trained musician. There was an idea that virtuosity or even knowledge about music was going to infect your innate originality. Mm-hmm. And look at what I was. I was a trained musician who liked to be funny. Mm-hmm. I was someone who was very, very ambitious and wanted to succeed. All of my core beliefs were in stark contrast to the religion, to the received wisdom of what indie rock was about. It made it very difficult for me. And I repressed those. And I thought, I will try to hide the fact that I'm a trained musician. I will repress my instinct to be funny. I will try to hide the fact that I'm as ambitious as I really am. These aren't things that are in fashion here. I was too aware of what the prevailing winds were, where they were blowing. I didn't have the strength to stick up for my own originality.
How many other young musicians fall into that trap? Like, it happens
all the time. And in fact, I remember doing some interviews and thinking, I'm not going to prepare for these interviews. That would go against what indie rock is all about. I'm not going to prepare or tell my story or try to control it, because that would make me a marketing man. I'm not that. I'm a pure instinctive musician. Oops, I'm good, as I called it back then. That's the big joke I have with my friend Leslie Feist is, oops, I'm good. That's not who I am. But I pretended that that was me. And then the articles would come out and I would hate how I'd been portrayed. And I realized if I don't try to control the story, if I don't supply my own mythology, they will make one for me.
Yes.
And that's what I took.
And you won't like it.
And you won't like it. And so I took that lesson with me to Berlin and decided that I'm going to find the storytelling points that will enable me to tell my own story. And I will exaggerate what I previously thought was something to be embarrassed of. I will exaggerate my virtuosity. I will call myself a musical genius preemptively. I will make everyone laugh. I will invite people to underestimate me, at the same time blow them away with my natural given musical talent and all the training I had, all of that time I spent as a kid escaping into music, getting really good at what I do. I wasn't going to hide it anymore. It was going to be front and center. I was going to let them know how ambitious I was. I was going to let them know how important it was for me to succeed. If they smell that desperation on me, so be it, because that desperation was a real thing that was in my mind. I needed to succeed. I needed to prove something to my dad. All these psychological factors that I needed to succeed. I needed to prove I could do it. And finally, I was liberated from all that indie rock BS that meant I had to hide that. And I could finally become myself and become more myself, to exaggerate all of that into a cartoon character of the desperate musical genius. Mm. That's who I am. That's who people are going to come see when they know that now when they come see me on stage, that they're going to feel that. They're going to feel that burning hot lava that's inside of me. And other musicians may have a different burning hot core of lava, and mazel tov to them. But I can only be me. And even if I think that it will turn some people off, I will find my audience eventually. That's what I realized in Berlin. And I built it up very, very slowly. But at some point, it was clear that, yes, when you become more yourself, you will find those people who relate, who identify, who recognize the burning hot authenticity. Despite the exaggeration, they'll feel that it comes from a place of deep truth.
How many times do we have to teach ourselves that same lesson over and over again? The more we are ourselves, the more we draw people to us.
Well, yes, and it's a whole other topic whether this has been possible in my personal life, which it hasn't.
Okay.
So I still have deep issues about becoming in terms of my non-professional life, as many artists do. The art becomes the receptacle for these fantasies and these longings to be different. I'm much more proactive. I'm much more, in my professional life, I'm much more forthcoming. It's much easier for me to say no to things in my professional life life than in my personal life, for example. So there is still that lesson to be learned in my personal life, and it may never get completely learned in my case, but it has been learned in my professional life enough that I can pass it on. I started this music school called the Conservatory to pass on this exact lesson. And the way that I get these musicians to become more themselves, what I wish a musician had been able to show me in that moment when I was signed to Warner Music, if I had been able to go to the Conservatory, what I would have learned is you need to make music under benevolent pressure. You need to create a controlled, loving crisis for these musicians. And the way you do that is by forcing them to compose and perform under time pressure and a constantly rotating cast of other musicians that they have to connect with. And by doing this, you scramble all of that self-regard. You scramble all of that, oh, but I'm not supposed to, because you look around and say, I'm not supposed to be funny. Well, if you're forced over the course of 5 days to compose literally dozens of songs when you have a 15 or 10 minute or 5 minute time limit, and you're forced to do it with a musician who comes from a completely different background than you, when you're a rapper from Houston and you have 5 minutes to create a song with a Ukrainian jazz saxophonist, well, you don't have time for self-regard. You don't have time for, is this me? You don't have time for any kind of self-judgment. And so I forced them to compose this music over the course of about 5 days with this constantly rotating cast of partners. And by the end of those 5 days, they've collectively written hundreds of songs that they then choose from. And for the following 5 days, we put that together into a concert where all these different groups of solos, duos, trios gets expanded out and becomes a 2-hour-long concert. And then over those 5 days, they're forced to play 4 concerts in 4 nights, finishing at a big 1,000-person show at a really proper venue. And over these 10 days, they haven't had a second to even think, is this me? Is this cool? Does this fit? I take them out of their environment and bring them somewhere. In this case, it was Cologne, Germany, a couple of months ago. And so they kind of get a retrofitted version of what I went through. What took me 15 years to understand, I am trying to condense into an educational method.
It's like a cleansing fire.
Yes, and they will experience what I experienced over the course of years, compressed into 10 days, and hopefully get at least a small percentage of what I got. I forced them to trust their instincts without just telling them the platitude, trust your instincts. It's very easy to go to a panel discussion and hear a musician say, you know what I learned? You have to trust your instincts, be more yourself. I'm interested in finding a reliable, proven method that will make the musicians understand that intuitively by experiencing it. It's one thing to tell people, don't be afraid of failure. But by forcing them to embrace failure constantly for 5 days, they suddenly develop an immunity to it. And so you haven't just told them in an abstract way, you need to fail sometimes, because everyone's afraid to do that. But if you immunize that fear by literally exposing them to it in the same way that we expose people to diseases to vaccinate them, I expose them to the disease of failure so that it won't affect them in the future. That's what's interesting to me now with looking back on my process of becoming, at least in the professional sense. As I mentioned, in the personal sense, it's a bit of a shit show still.
I don't think we have time for that.
No. And I have a professional who I talk to make sure that it's in the appropriate venue. But with the Conservatory, I'm just trying to sort of retro-engineer what I went through, the lessons I learned. I have to create a family out of those musicians that I bring to the Conservatory, because when I had a family of musicians, which was people like Peaches and Feist and Maki and all these musical family members of mine, where the line between work and pure pleasure of hanging out was just erased, I try to create that. That was an important lesson for me, to not just work with hired guns who maybe didn't really truly share my vision. Better to find people, take the time to find people who truly share your vision, and then figure out what the band will be or what the situation will be. That's a lesson that I have to make the Conservatorians learn. And the way I do it is by choosing them so that they will become a musical family, and gambling that my intuition is good enough to know these 7 or 8 people will create amongst themselves a musical family over these 10 days. So far, it's worked. my lesson about you have to control your own narrative rather than have the outside world created for you. That's something that I have to impart to them all in 10 days. So I just sort of at some point started making a list of my epiphanies and seeing how can I retro-engineer this? How can they experience this epiphany in 10 days? It took me 10 years. How can I do that? And this is what the Conservatory project is about. I'm still at the beginning. I've only done it 3 times. But I hope over 5 or 10 years, by choosing these, in a way, elite, hand-picked musicians, gives me a playground to try to understand, what kind of exercise followed by another exercise seems to have the greatest effect. I'm very much inspired by Pilates. So this was invented by Joseph Pilates, starting in the 50s and 60s, has now become a worldwide phenomenon. But Pilates is a series of physically self-actualizing exercises that go in a specific order. And Pilates started working with very elite dancers, people like Martha Graham and high-end athletes. And then very gradually shifted his focus to training teachers. And this is something that I've done as well. One of the first Conservatory students in 2018 came back in 2019 as a teacher. So I hope that every year I can pluck 1 or 2 out of my group, train them as Conservatory teachers so that this can transcend my own personality and my own physical presence. And that maybe, just maybe, if I may dream and be such a megalomaniac with this project, that maybe this will even outlast my time here on Earth, and that this Conservatory method can be something that provides a kind of musical health to people, even if they're amateurs and have no desire to become professionals. Because when you create under pressure with your instincts, you learn about yourself. That's what being an artist actually is. You make things and you learn about yourself by making things. And I always tell people, make more things so you learn more. Stop watching what others are doing. Become more internally curious. Don't be curious about who's put out an interesting album. Get curious about your next album.
That sounds like a lovely, huge, big leap for you into a new thing. But I felt that way about you when you put out solo piano for the first time. I listened to the first album, looking at it sideways, waiting for that sardonic, biting wit of yours, some kind of ironic edge to the solo piano. I waited for it and I never got it. And it was such a different side of you that I want to find out what was it like for you to let that part out of you, which seemed so different than what was going on in the past.
I suppose the album really happened by accident, first of all. I really backed into it. There was a room with a piano and it was called a DAT machine, a digital audio tape.
Those.
Yeah. And a couple of microphones. I don't know why. And at some point I just set them up and I started to compose pieces. And at the time I was producing an album for a very big French artist, actually English artist living in France, Jane Birkin, the widow of Serge Gainsbourg. It was a very fraught experience. It was a lot of people around. She's kind of like French musical royalty. I couldn't really be myself. I had to play my part within a much bigger structure. So I was learning. I was keeping my head down and I was learning. It's not my most natural way to be, so it was exhausting. I can do it, but it requires a lot of me to not be myself in the studio. And I needed an outlet. And the outlet turned out to be to go into that room, play the piano, and eventually I set up those microphones and I just thought, I wonder what these pieces can become. Maybe I'll send these to a singer and they'll write songs to them. Maybe these will be sampled for electronic albums. I don't know. And then it's kind of dawned on me that it maybe in and of itself, it had a kind of musical power. But the trick was to tell myself that I'm just going to release this. And the little foothold that I had by then, I was only 3 or 4 years into my Chili Gonzales sort of hipster Berlin career at that point. And so it felt like likely this will just be a side project for those fans of mine who will be able to hear that side of me sort of hidden within my sort of more attention-getting bravado. As it turned out, that musical power was so intense that it quickly leapfrogged the career I'd had up until then. And then it became more of how do I get on stage and deliver this music to people without giving the impression that I'm trying to be taken seriously? How do I, in a way, continue to be myself? Because the temptation with a piano album is a little bit what you described. This is the real him. He doesn't have to try to yell at us. He doesn't have to try to get attention. That's partly true, but in another way it's not. And I didn't want to lose that part. People projected onto that album that they were hearing something more real. And I think that is a little bit of a byproduct of the fact that the piano is a kind of base atomic level instrument of music, of Western music. The piano is the only instrument that can truly deliver melody, harmony, and rhythm with one person playing it. It has this iconic stature. It's the orchestra. It's managed to survive. I'm sitting here looking at a piano in a studio right now. You listen to rap music, there's piano in it. You listen to electronic music, there's piano. Piano is everywhere. So for me to reduce my musicality so that it can be delivered on just that instrument, because of that singular power of there being no subdivision beneath the piano, that's the atomic level of music. You can't split it up any further. And that gives the impression of more authenticity. But I truly believe that my solo piano music isn't necessarily more authentic than any other music I've done. But I understand the temptation for it to seem like that. And the fact that there is no voice automatically means that there is not a verbal dimension compared to some of my other music, which does have voice or vocals or rapping or singing. But the way I see it is the minute you add something to solo piano, even if it's a cello, I lose power. If I sing on top of it, I lose even more power. If that piano is then backed up by a drum machine, I lose even more power. I might gain other things, but fundamentally I'm losing power because the atom is the most powerful unit of all, and all music is made of it, and the piano is the atomic instrument to me. Perhaps you could say it's the Platonic ideal of an instrument. You know, I remember being a kid and learning, okay, what is the Platonic ideal? So I'm looking around and I see a lot of squares. Your iPad is a square. I'm looking at a weird box where the wires are going into, that's a square. And your glasses are squares, and all these different things are squares. How do I know what a square is? There is some image of a square, an abstract square, the uber square, that doesn't exist anywhere in reality. But every time I see a square, I'm comparing it to something, an abstract. That's what the Platonic ideal of a square is. And there's a world called the Platonic world of forms, where all of these shapes and things exist that we're constantly seeing in regular earthbound life and secretly comparing it to that abstract version. And so I think of the piano, when you play a song on the piano, if I go over to that piano and play Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana, I am in essence representing a Platonic ideal of what that song is. Right. I have divorced it from the guitar. I have divorced it from the drums. I've divorced it from the voice of Kurt Cobain. I've even taken the lyrics out. I have somehow reached an essence of Smells Like Teen Spirit that you shouldn't actually encounter in the real world, that should only exist in the Platonic world of forms. And that's why when I play my solo piano music, it's as if it's never been arranged. It's as if it never left the Platonic world of forms, because I'm only presenting an essence. That's the power of...
That's what it feels like. It feels like an essence.
Yes.
That's what that music feels like.
So that is not the same as hearing the real me.
No.
There's a small difference there, but I understand that it translates as authenticity, or it translates as no schnick-schnacks, no bullshit, or it translates as something more sincere. Even though it's actually not any of those things more than my other music, but that power of the Platonic ideal of what the piano represents, this atomic base level of music, of chords and melody, and that's all it is, and that's all it can ever be, has such a huge power that the minute anything is added to it, it changes. It changes. It would be like introducing a virus into the most pristine natural environment. It will just never be the same.
does it do for your headspace to go to that headspace when you're sitting playing that kind of music?
I feel like I'm driving a Ferrari. I'm aware that I'm creating power. I'm aware that I am creating a very intense and hopefully positive musical energy. And whether people intellectually understand that intensity, they will use words like sincere. They will use words like simple. They will use words like unpretentious. They will use words like pure. And those are all code for that intensity that I've identified as being related to that Platonic ideal of music. And I've done albums with string quartet, and I've made that bargain where I say, okay, I'm going to add something to this, knowing I will lose something. When I've done songs with vocals, I'm aware of cutting into that power, but it's always something I can come back to. And of course, those albums, those 3 solo piano albums, have been by far the ones that connect the most with people. They've been successful by any metric you could use because of that power. And so I'm aware of it. And it's something I can always come back to, but I haven't yet thought to myself that I will only ever exist in that mode. I still feel that I will continue to make music with other people, with other instruments. I'm willing to sacrifice some of that atomic power to gain something else, as long as I know I can come back to it.
Was that atomic power something that made you leave Canada? Because it was a part of what you knew about music that you couldn't include when you were in Canada trying to be an indie rock star.
I guess it happened in a bit of a later wave, but in a sense, the idea that I had to become myself, that much I knew, is in a way related. Because what I needed to do is find that sort of atomic energy within myself, a kind of courage in some way to risk embarrassment, to risk feeling uncool, if I can put it more precisely, in order to gamble that at some later point, I will see that for the irrelevant distraction that it truly was. I mean, now I think, oh my God, thank goodness that I didn't use being cool as the guiding principle, as my North Star back then. Thank God I had the courage to risk that. And the irony is I was celebrated by the Berlin hipster world as someone incredibly cool when me and Peaches came out. We were nothing but cool. And we were in The Face and Jockey Slut and Sleaze Nation and all these uber cool magazines coming out of England, and the Berlin underground is blowing up. And so the irony was, by risking being uncool, finally I got it and didn't care. And so it was shown to be the fleeting, ephemeral goal that it was. And then in a second wave, I was able to learn the lesson of solo piano and this idea of finding the atomic energy that I was capable of producing at the piano came in a second wave. First, I had to deal with my psychology and get to the point where I could become myself and present myself to an audience in a way that was at once exaggerated but based on that deepest core of authenticity. And in a later moment, that was proven to be right, that I became cool by finally risking being uncool, kind of relaxed something. And it was kind of like the first level of the video game that I had to get through. The second level of the video game was to do the piano album.
You talk about risking, you talk about
Excuse me.
You talk about risk, you talk about courage. Does fear fit into this formula as well? Is that part of it? Stepping out on stage to do anything? Is fear there, or is it got some other molten lava quality to it?
Yeah, well, I mean, courage and risk are obviously related to fear. Risk exists because we're afraid of not getting the result we want. And finding courage is literally facing fear. I would say that the lesson of being around a group of friends who feel like a tribe, a like-minded tribe, to be around Peaches, very specifically in terms of performance and letting go on stage. She really taught me a lot. She was very fearless. She would say the same about me. We both laugh that, wait, no, you were my mentor, and no, you were my mentor, but somehow we became each other's mentors. We were fearless in different ways. And to this day, I really know that it wouldn't have been possible without her and other musicians around at that time, but specifically her, to understand that to be on stage, there is no fear of embarrassment. You can't be embarrassed on stage if you create the rules of the game in which embarrassment doesn't exist. It's a bit hard to explain, but a lot of time the people will say, I prefer being in the studio. I feel like there's more control there. I think to myself, when I'm in a studio, that's where I feel I have no control because I don't know who I'm performing for. When you're performing, you have people in front of you. You have all the knowledge you need. You read the room. You look into their eyes. You feel their vibe. They'll tell you what they need. To be in the studio is pissing in the wind. Who is this for? Who's going to listen to this? Where and when? It's confounding. When I record, I bring friends to the studio. Those solo piano albums, there's at least one, sometimes two or three people sitting on chairs, hanging out. I need people in front of me to do what I do. So I say, you have it all wrong. The studio is where you're out of control. You have all the control in the world. If you open up, if you let yourself be vulnerable, the audience will forgive everything. It's an embarrassment-free zone. And yet so many people are afraid of it because they think they'll be embarrassed, because they're trying to keep that control. And when you give it up and you tell the audience, you don't tell them verbally, but you let them know, you telegraph that you are putting yourself in danger, you are getting all their sympathy, because we all know how hard that is to be in danger. And right away, they love you. They identify with you. You are representing the human condition to them before you've even started. But you have to be open. They have to know it. They have to feel it. But then you can't possibly be embarrassed. This is, again, a kind of inoculation. It's kind of the vaccine of failure that I was talking about earlier with the conservatory. And it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing when you realize that when you walk out onto a stage, the audience wants you to succeed. And if you flounder, if you make mistakes along the way, they'll forgive you. Everything is forgiven when you're on stage. And so control isn't even an issue because you are among a supportive group of humans. They took time out of their schedules to be there. They paid money. What are they looking for? Why do they do it? Sometimes I go, there's 2,000 people here. I'm busy. I don't go out that often. I don't do that a lot. What are they looking for? What do they want? Do they want to see a superhero? No. They want to see a flawed human being. They want to see struggle. They want someone to incarnate their own struggles, their own difficulties. If it seems too easy, it's not going to work. So you need to be constantly putting yourself in what's essentially a benevolent danger. I mean, it's not real danger. It's not physical danger. It's not life or death. But why does a performer have adrenaline from the minute they walk out on stage? Adrenaline was first created when you're being chased by a fucking panther in the savannah. Mm-hmm. Luckily, here in Canada in 2020, we don't have that risk. It's not very often that we're chased by panthers. What has taken that place, rather than a fear of death that brings adrenaline, is a fear of humiliation. That's a fate worse than death for many people. But if you go out there and show that you're willing to embrace that.
Which you do by walking out on stage in a dressing gown and looking like the last time I saw you, came out looking like you were in your pajamas in a dressing gown. Right off the top there. Humiliation.
Yes. Certainly not in a tuxedo, which speaks another message.
Exactly.
And so, yes, I'm very conscious of that first impression that has an element of ridicule, that has an element of humiliation in it. But also, a kind of intimacy.
And the way that you end the concert, to me, is that concert was the most vulnerable thing because the lights went down. And there is a man in his pajamas and dressing gown at a piano playing in the dark, which is probably the most intimate, vulnerable thing that I've ever seen in a piano or any kind of concert. And the payoff for that was so wonderful. We all felt, and I felt like I knew what it was like for you, living wherever you're living, sitting at night, playing the piano by yourself in the dark. I felt like I was there in your living room with you when you were just playing the piano. That was the biggest gift. Thank you for that.
I don't know what to say.
It was lovely. I've written a story about that. And I'm writing now, we're doing 2 episodes about intervals and about how each interval comes with its own emotional flavor.
Musical intervals?
Yes.
You have no idea. So, I'm very, very close friends and close collaborator with Leslie Feist,
Yes.
celebrated Canadian iconic singer. And she and I invented a game where we sing each interval, but we created a sentence that goes with each one. So, for example, the interval of a flat sixth, we identified as balloon floating away on your 5th birthday or something like this. You know, we created these sentences that sort of, with a very specific image, captured some universal emotion that we think that interval leads to us. And it took us a while, and then we would just do it. So we would go like, oh, I forget what it is. I wish I could remember what they were, but we would actually sing these. So at some point we'd be like, balloon floating away on your 5th birthday. Then the shard of a mountain that comes down in an avalanche or whatever it was, you know. And we had this game and we would just literally start with the minor second and we would go all the way to the octave. And it was just like a nerdy musical game, but exactly honing in on what you're talking about. And this is when people say you're great at explaining music and all that, and they say, but is there a secret to writing a good song or writing a hit song? I say, oh gosh, no, of course not. There is an X factor. The fact that I say that there is this kind of arpeggio used in this Daft Punk hit, I'm not saying that's why the song is so good. But this relationship that how can music be such a physical and scientific reality? This idea of frequencies and sympathetic harmonies and all this stuff that I don't know that much about, but I know that there is a very scientific basis for all of it. How is it possible that science creates such emotion? That's why I'm looking for the link between what the musical tools are and how we then experience it as a listener with such musical intensity. How do you get from 45 kilohertz to goosebumps? And this is why I try to unlock the tools of music on stage for people or in my videos. It's not because I'm saying there's no magic here. It's all just because if you have this chord progression, your song is going to be a hit. It's not nearly that cynical. It's the opposite. It's marveling at how is it possible that on one end there's magic, but on the other end there's technique, and on the other end there's scientific reality. And it comes down to storytelling so often. What stories does music tell? Often it's tension and release. It's the same stories that are being told in novels. A novel that has no conflict maybe is an interesting experiment, but fundamentally is betraying what literature is supposed to do. I'm old-fashioned that way. I'm all for experiments, but in the end, I don't think there's a substitute for storytelling. And sometimes I meet musicians who say, oh, I'm trying to write music that doesn't have a story. I say, Mazel tov. Not for me. I'm not going to listen to that. I also don't want to watch a movie where nothing happens.
Mm. Well, for me, your interval is a minor sixth. Does that make sense?
I'll take it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having
being
me.
here. That was Chili Gonzales. Becoming more yourself. It is a lifelong quest. And every time we get a step closer to being our true selves, we say, what took me so long? What was I so afraid of? Why didn't I do this 10 years ago? So what's your next move? I'm Lori Brown. Have a great night and have a great day.